In this video, I'm going to point out the various differences between the US and UK editions of Rainbow Magic number 5, Sky the Blue Fairy. The British edition is the original one. The American edition made over 200 changes to the text. For example, we have 5 changes to the poem that appears before the table of contents. Thick Ice Form becomes Thick Ice Forms. Mortal World becomes Human World. This Fateful Day becomes This Day. Have Been Found becomes Are Safe and Sound. Must Seek Out becomes Must Track Down. Chapter 1. The numbering changes. The US version starts on page 1, but the UK version starts on page 9. Laughed Rachel Walker becomes Rachel Walker Said, Laughing. Swishing becomes Dipping. Rock Pool becomes Tide Pool, here and everywhere else it appears. Mind You Don't Slip becomes Be Careful Not to Slip. Further Down becomes Farther Down. Mrs. Walker becomes Rachel's mom. Mum becomes Mom. Everywhere it appears. As she looked down at her bare feet becomes She looked down at her bare feet, and Seaweed began becomes Seaweed beneath them began. Underneath it becomes Tangled up in the seaweed. Rachel went over to Kersey becomes Rachel hopped across the rocks. I wonder, could it be? Becomes I wonder if it could be. The sentence, a few days before Rachel and Kersey had discovered a magical secret, is added to the text. Jack Frost becomes the wicked Jack Frost. They becomes the fairies. On becomes all over. To help find them becomes that they would help find the fairies. Like Fern becomes like Fern was. Saffron becomes Sunny, here and everywhere else her name is mentioned. Scuttled becomes Crawled. The colors of the rainbow are written on the illustration. That's removed. The seaweed becomes Seaweed at Kersey's feet. It becomes the crab. A bit like becomes scratchy like. A claw becomes one claw. Further becomes farther. Along under becomes along the beach under. Scuttled away for becomes rushed forward. He said in his scratchy voice becomes he said. Perhaps becomes maybe. Scuttled becomes moved off the rocks and headed. Overhead becomes over the beach. Holiday becomes vacation. Pop back becomes head back. Fetch becomes make. The sentence, you girls stay out of the water until we get back, okay? Is added to Mrs. Walker's speech. 3 rainbow fairies still to find becomes 3 more rainbow fairies to find. Izzy becomes Inky, here and everywhere else her name is mentioned. Left becomes headed off towards the cottages. Again becomes again this time. Stop by becomes stop next to. Scuttled becomes hurried. Mad becomes crazy. Fizzed like lemonade becomes fizzed like ginger ale. Chapter 2. Scuttled out of sight becomes disappeared. Pool becomes tide pool. Can you see the blue fairy becomes can you see the blue fairy, Rachel? Kersey felt disappointed becomes Kersey sighed, disappointed. Goblins have found her becomes goblins found her first. They'll becomes those goblins will. Getting back becomes from getting back. The sentence, it's so pretty, is added after Rachel gasped. This becomes this voice. Peered right in becomes peered into the water. Rippling water becomes rippling seaweed. Just then is added before a huge bubble. Their eyes very wide becomes with wide eyes. It's her is added after Kersey gasped. Hairband becomes headband, tiny becomes little, and she was holding a silver wand is removed. Sky said in a tiny voice becomes Sky said. Her tiny voice. Like becomes sounded like, stirred becomes swept through, pool becomes tide pool here and on the next page. The word crackling is removed. Near becomes close, gasped becomes cried, bobbing becomes bobbing in the water. Sky looked becomes Rachel and Kirsty could see that Sky looked. The sentence starting with I've left is split into 2 sentences after the word rucksack, with on being turned to it's on. I've left becomes I left. Rucksack becomes backpack, here and everywhere else it's mentioned. Way down on the beach is added to the end of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Fetch becomes grab. Warm them becomes warm them up. Chilly becomes very cold. I'll stay here becomes I'll stay here with Sky. I won't be long becomes I will. Took out becomes pulled out. Slipped becomes slid. There becomes inside. Smooth and shiny becomes smooth. It makes sense to remove the word shiny because the stone's inside Rachel's pocket at this point. How can she tell if it's shiny or not? A bit becomes like, felt very puzzled becomes was confused, it becomes the stone, then becomes just then, hotter and hotter becomes it became warmer and warmer, hot becomes warm, in delight becomes and smiled, back becomes back to the tide pool, dead becomes dead in her tracks, on her own becomes alone, the word hook-nosed is removed, beside becomes next to, shoe is removed, them becomes the goblins, Rachel didn't feel quite so scared either, becomes Rachel didn't feel scared. I guess she's braver in the American edition. She'd brought becomes she had, yelled one of the goblins becomes one of the goblins yelled. The word stumpy is removed. Sideways becomes to his sides, away from her is removed. He cried is added after can't catch me. Get out becomes get out of the bubble. Twirl becomes twirl on the ice. Screwed up his nose becomes wrinkled his nose. Wrinkled his nose and stuck out his tongue are swapped. The sentence, you girls can't do anything about it, is added before, hey, look at me. Behind him becomes behind himself. Whizzed round becomes spun around. Crossly becomes angrily. The other one becomes the clumsy one. The goblins tried becomes then the goblins tried. Magic becomes magical. Slithering about becomes sliding around. Rushed becomes hurried. They've becomes there. She poked becomes Kirsty moved her hand closer to Sky and poked. Free of becomes out of. Her everywhere becomes every part of her. Said becomes whispered. Something's wrong becomes something's really wrong. She's gone becomes she looks. You could becomes the girls could. As if becomes like. The blue crab becomes just then the blue crab. Herself becomes her body. What's the matter becomes what's wrong. We've got to becomes we have to. Look down in dismay at Sky becomes look down at Sky in dismay. Curled up becomes the fairy was curled up. Prick becomes sting. Ill becomes sick. Chapter 4. Moving becomes moving down on the rock. Waggling becomes wiggling. Madly becomes wildly. Look, she said, is moved up one sentence. Scuttled becomes scurried. Claws becomes claws in the air. What's he going to do becomes what's he doing? Wondered becomes asked. We're coming becomes crawled. Pattered becomes scrambled. About becomes around. Prodded becomes poked. The words feeling very are removed. Just then becomes all of a sudden. Something becomes something in the rock. Gritty crunch becomes crunch. Searched out becomes searched for. Round becomes around. Brought becomes gathered. Warm sky up becomes warm up sky. Would becomes will. Smelling of blueberries becomes its own sentence. Reading, it smelled like blueberries. Disappeared becomes disappeared in the air. The word is deleted. Her dress still pale becomes its own sentence, which reads, her dress was still very pale. The sentence, she looked up at Rachel and Kirsty, is added before Sky talks. Lovely becomes nice. Will make becomes will help make. Their little stalk eyes becomes their eyes. Crunched becomes walked. Had got becomes had come. Chapter 5. Fields becomes beach. In the warm becomes inside the warm. Glade becomes clearing. Looked round becomes glanced around. Oh no becomes sky. Oh no. I must becomes I have to. Orange dust becomes orange bubbles. Shot becomes sprayed. Bubbles and flowers becomes bubbles, flowers. Clustered becomes gathered. Happy to see her sisters is added after gave a weak smile. Then flopped becomes then she flopped. Zoomed becomes flew. Brightly becomes brightly in the air. Underneath becomes under. All their sisters becomes all 7 sisters. Beside becomes next to. The sentence, the goblins came very close to Sky and now she's really cold, is added before the sentence starting with we have to make. Sky becomes her. You must becomes you must all. The word fairies is removed from Bertram's dialogue. You'll soon feel better becomes you'll feel better soon. Transparent becomes see-through. The rainbow fairies becomes the rest of the rainbow fairies. Exclaimed fern becomes asked fern. Chapter 6. You all becomes you fairies. Bertram's right becomes but Bertram's right. Perhaps becomes maybe. Manage becomes do. Circle becomes circle in the air. Appear at becomes watching from. To get becomes get. Fern and the girls becomes Fern, Rachel, and Kirsty. Had been chasing becomes were chasing. The word multicolored is removed. Short dress becomes little dress. As becomes while. Laughed becomes shouted. Twirl, her wings flashing becomes twirl, and her wings flashed. Clustered round becomes gathered around. Nearly becomes almost. Beamed becomes grinned. The words perch on are removed. Thank you becomes thanks. Waiting becomes waiting at the beach. Oh yes becomes oh that's right. A bit becomes a little. Fluttered becomes fluttered in the air. Beside becomes next to. Glade becomes clearing. Holiday becomes vacation. Nearly becomes almost. Preview of the next book. Now it's time for Rachel and Kirsty to help. Becomes Ruby, Amber, Sunny, Fern, and Sky are all safe. But where is... The sentence time is running out is added after Inky's name. Read on for a sneak peek becomes join Kirsty and Rachel's adventure in this special sneak peek. Purpley black becomes purplish black. Here becomes here at least. Round becomes around. There was just room becomes there was just enough room. The sentence, it changes all the time, is added before the sentence starting with it might be. On holiday becomes for a week-long vacation. Fairies who had been cast out of fairyland by evil Jack Frost becomes fairies. The fairies brought color to fairyland, but mean Jack Frost had sent them away with a wicked spell. They only had becomes Rachel and Kirsty only had. She reminded Kirsty becomes Rachel reminded Kirsty. Stop us finding becomes stop us from finding. Bluey purple becomes purplish blue. Bluey purple becomes purplish blue a second time. The preview in the British edition ends after the word Christmas. The American edition continues the story for 6 more paragraphs. Read becomes read the rest of. What adventures are in store for Kirsty and Rachel becomes if the swirling snowstorm is truly magical. Not to spoil the next book in the series, but yeah, it is magic. Fairy magic! And that's it. It's about 240 changes for a 73-page book, or 3.2 changes per page.